Ever wonder how a country pays off a multi-billion-dollar credit card bill? Well, let's dive right into this explainer and crack open the state ledger. Today, we're putting on our sovereign debt management specialist hats to see exactly how governments manage and clear what they owe. We're going to systematically walk through the 8 distinct liquidation pathways states use to redeem their debt, moving all the way from standard accounting maneuvers to absolute break glass in case of emergency interventions.
We've got a clear playbook today. First, we'll define public debt. Then, we'll look at restructuring and delaying, followed by gradual repayment strategies, some pretty drastic domestic measures, and finally, the external debt solution.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, defining public debt.
Before we get into exactly how governments clear the books, we really need to nail down what we're trying to clear. The big takeaway here, public debt isn't just one giant uniform monolith. The source defines it specifically as the debt a government owes either to its own subjects or to the nationals of other countries. And, that distinction is absolutely crucial. I mean, think about it. Managing debt you owe to your own citizens, essentially owing your neighbor, requires a totally different toolkit than managing debt you owe to a foreign bank across the globe. Knowing exactly who holds that IOU sets the stage for why some of the redemption methods we're about to cover are just routine finance, while others are, frankly, shocking.
So let's get into those tools, starting with Section 2, restructuring and delaying.
Now, the contrast between our first 2 liquidation pathways is super interesting. Method 1 is refunding. This is where a government simply issues fresh bonds to pay off older maturing bonds. It's kind of like if you couldn't pay your credit card this month, so you just took out a brand new loan to cover the old one. The actual money burden isn't liquidated at all. It's just postponed to a future date. You're literally just kicking the financial can down the road, hoping a future economy can handle it. Compare that to Method 2, debt conversion. This happens when a government swaps out old, high-interest debt for new, low-interest debt, usually when market rates happen to take a dip. Unlike refunding, debt conversion genuinely lowers the state's payment burden, saving money in the long run. But there's a catch. This is only on the table if the government has stellar creditworthiness. Because let's face it, nobody is letting you refinance if they don't trust you to pay them back.
Moving right along to Section 3, gradual repayment strategies.
Our source text highlights 3 dedicated pathways for systematic debt clearing here: the budgetary surplus, terminal annuities, and the sinking fund. Instead of just shifting money around or kicking that can down the road, these methods demand some strict adherence to a long-term financial roadmap. Let's break them down.
Method 3 is the budgetary surplus. So, occasionally, a government manages to actually generate a surplus, meaning they magically collected more in taxes than they spent on operations. When that happens, the state can take that excess revenue and just buy its own bonds directly back from the market. Doing this automatically liquidates that debt liability. It's a beautifully straightforward way to gradually pay off debt. But let's be real, producing a surplus budget, that's a pretty rare phenomenon these days. For most modern economies, it's way more of a theoretical ideal than an everyday reality.
Then we've got Method 4, terminal annuities. Here, the government structures its debt repayment in equal annual installments. You can think of this exactly like a standard fixed-rate mortgage or a car loan. Every time a payment is made, they aren't just covering the interest fee, they're actually paying down a chunk of the principal debt too. By systematically blending the principal and interest into these steady, predictable payments, the overall burden just goes on diminishing annually. They keep chipping away at it year after year until, by maturity, it's completely paid off.
And that brings us to Method 5, the sinking fund. Sometimes, a state sets up an entirely separate, dedicated fund just for debt repayment. It's basically a giant, untouchable national piggy bank. The government carves out a specific slice of its revenue every single year and drops it straight into this fund. This money is completely ring-fenced, meant exclusively for paying off loans and interest, and it absolutely cannot be touched for regular government spending. Because it forces this consistent saving and removes the temptation to spend cash on short-term political goals. The sinking fund is widely considered the absolute holy grail of state fiscal discipline.
But what if discipline isn't enough? That brings us to Section 4, drastic domestic measures.
Yeah, when routine plays and gradual steps aren't cutting it, governments escalate to the absolute most aggressive tactics in their playbook. Method 6 is a statutory reduction in the rate of interest, and this one usually rears its head during a severe financial crisis. The government takes a statutory legal decision to just slash the interest rate it pays on its public debt. They don't ask politely, they don't negotiate with lenders, they simply mandate the change from the top down.
Just take a look at this quote straight from the source text. The creditors are forced to accept the reduced rate of interest in view of the statutory powers of the government. I mean, imagine your bank calling you up and saying they're unilaterally changing your loan terms just because they make the rules.
That is the sheer, mandatory power the state wields during a crisis. As a sovereign entity, when push comes to shove and a nation faces financial collapse, it can legally force the slashed rates on its creditors. The investors and bondholders? They have absolutely no choice in the matter.
Next up is Method 7, the capital levy. This is a very heavy, immediate tax imposed directly on property and wealth. Now, we're not talking about your standard annual income tax here. This acts like a massive, one-time wealth tax targeted squarely at the capital assets of the rich and propertied individuals in a society. Its entire core purpose is to quickly generate an enormous pile of cash to pay off huge, sudden obligations. Think staggering, economy-crushing wartime debts.
The thing about the capital levy is that its usefulness is incredibly context-dependent. On one hand, right after a major crisis, like a world war, it's considered a quick, equitable way to repay debt, clear the ledger, and hit the reset button on the economy. But on the other hand, the text makes it abundantly clear this is absolutely not a practical method during normal, stable times. Slapping a massive, surprise wealth tax on citizens during peacetime, that would be a massive shock to the system. It would instantly destroy investment, panic the markets, and completely halt capital formation. So, for sure, this is a true break-glass measure.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the external debt solution.
This is our eighth and final pathway, which tackles the really unique, complex challenge of external debt. See, external debt isn't like domestic debt, where you owe your own citizens. You usually have to pay back other nations in foreign exchange. So, how does a government get foreign exchange? By generating an export surplus. The country literally has to manufacture and export more goods to the rest of the world than it imports. That's how it earns the foreign currency it desperately needs to service that external debt.
And this brings us to a pretty stark reality regarding how that original foreign loan was actually used. The source outlines two distinct outcomes. If the government took those foreign loans and invested them into industries that produce exportable goods, like, say, new factories or infrastructure, then generating that export surplus becomes a natural economic byproduct, and repayment is relatively easy. But if the loans were used unproductively, well, the government still desperately needs that foreign exchange to avoid a default, so they have to force an export surplus by reducing the availability of goods for their own domestic consumption. They literally have to deprive their own citizens of goods so those products can be shipped abroad to pay off the state's debts.
As the source material grimly notes, when domestic goods are artificially reduced to service external loans, the ultimate burden of that debt is felt directly and quite painfully by the people. Which leaves us with this final, provocative question to consider. When a government uses its statutory powers to restrict domestic consumption just to pay off its unproductive external debts, does the state ledger really clear, or is the true burden of the debt simply shifted off the state's balance sheet and straight onto the backs of its citizens? It's a fascinating look at the real-world impact of sovereign debt, and definitely something to keep in mind the next time you hear about a country's financial ledger.